My name is Jennifer Gray. I'm the Public Services Coordinator for the Library and Learning Commons here at FSCJ, and we are very thankful to have with us this evening something of a local phenomenon. She's a local artist, activist, and educator, Hope McMath. She is the founder and director of Yellow House, which if you have not been out there, please do make a trip. It is amazing. And we are lucky to have her here tonight speaking to us about the history of art and social movements. Now, because this does touch lightly on politics, we have to say the same thing we say every time anyone might say anything political at an event of ours, which is the Library and Learning Commons does not necessarily agree or endorse any views of any speakers here tonight. That includes you guys, so if you shout anything political, we don't endorse you either. Thank you very much for coming, and I won't take up any more of your time. Let's give a round of applause for Hope McMath.
Good evening, good evening. I am really glad to be here. I'm thrilled to see so many students here and some friends in the audience as well. So I want to start by saying as we're going through this, it's heavy on visuals. I'd rather not just strictly talk at you. So if at any point you're curious, you want to debate me, you want to support what I'm saying, whatever it is, just jump in. I'd much rather this be a bit of give and take. So if you feel compelled to do some give and take, please jump in. And I also, anytime I'm talking, especially out in public, and there's something else going on that's weighing on my own mind, I often feel like it's important to bring it into this space rather than denying it. I think one of the ways to create a gracious, safe, courageous, not always comfortable space is to speak truth to it right away. And I have to tell you, right now, though it has nothing to do with this topic, my mind is in Paris. And I wanted to channel that into the room, and I want to read you a brief poem by Willa Cather. Again, has nothing to do with the topic at hand, except that it is about the power of art. And it is a poem written about Paris. Behind the arch of glory sets the day. The river lies in curves of silver light. The fields Elysian glitter in a spray of golden dust. The gilded dome is bright. The towers of Notre Dame cut clean and gray the evening sky. And pale from left to right, 100 bridges leap from either quay. Pillared with pride, the city of delight sits like an empress with her silver seine, heavy with jewels, all her splendid dower flashing upon her, won from shore and main by shock of combat, sacked from town and tower. Wherever men have builded hall or fane, red war hath gleaned for her, and men have slain to deck her loveliness. I feel again that joy which brings her art to faultless flower, that passion of her kings who reign upon reign, arrayed her star by star with pride and power. So tonight we are thinking of the collapse of Notre Dame. But we are actually here to talk about the art of protest, which is also this sort of strange combination of words, moments in time, the connecting of the past to today. It's a topic that's close to my heart, which I'll explain a little bit more in a moment. But when I say these words, the art of protest, what do you think of? What images, people, ideas come to mind when I say art and protest? Banksy. That's a good one. We'll touch on Banksy tonight. Warhol. Yeah. Keith Haring we will touch on tonight. What else? Norman Rockwell. And I did not put Norman Rockwell in this talk, but we could have. Absolutely. Daumier, he's a good one, right? Yeah. Sort of early, this idea of political cartoons, some of our great visual artists, and sort of the blurring of the edges between them. He's a good one too. Is all art of protest visual?
Nope.
What else do we think of when we think of protest art?
Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is a great example. In fact, I was going to open this playing some Bob Dylan, right? But if you ask Bob Dylan, he would tell you he was not a political person and actually wasn't interested in it at all. That what he was really writing about were the things that Bob Dylan cared about. But he was a man of the moment. He was a man of his time. And so the rest of the world sort of co-opted him into being a political force, whether he wanted to be or not, right? So when we talk about the art of protest, it covers a lot. And we could sit here literally for 3 weeks and not stop talking about it. So this sort of scratches the surface in a way. In fact, some of the names you mentioned aren't even in this, though every one of them could be. So I've tried to include some people that you would know, artists that you wouldn't necessarily know, and really connecting what's happening in the creation of art and what's happening in the world and why those things actually get connected. And it makes sense, right? Because if we say that art has the power to give people a way to process the world around them, to connect to other people, right? To articulate both our frustrations and our dreams, right? We say art is our therapist, right? If it's all of those things, it makes sense that art would also then be a tool for protest, right? A tool for activism. So throughout this talk, I've got a couple of quotes, and they're not all by artists. Some of them are and some of them aren't, but I love this one by Albert Einstein. The revolution introduced me to art, and in turn, art introduced me to the revolution. This idea of this cycle of art often being what introduces people to new ideas, fresh perspectives, right? A different way of viewing the world. Sometimes a way to understand lived experiences that are different than your own, right? So art is sometimes that introduction, right? And sometimes it's the revolution that's the introduction into the power of what art can be. And so tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about the cycle of those. And this, though it may seem trite, I show this to you because that raised fist, that action, that visual of power, which actually even got included in the graphics for tonight's talk, is something that we understand pretty easily when we look at it. What do you think of when you see a raised fist like these? Strength. Unity. What else? Black Panthers. Resistance. Courage. Taking action. Union. Billy Owens. Wow, that is a lot to pack into one little image, right? But you're proving a really important point by you bubbling up your reactions to these images. Protest art often is art that needs to be read clearly, right? It needs to be able to speak to a lot of people, even if sometimes it's focusing on a fairly finite issue or idea. So symbols mean a lot when we're talking about the art of protest, right? Doesn't mean that their meanings can't mean something different across cultures and across people, right? And that can get tricky when you're dealing with the art of protest, but there are these sort of images and ideas that sort of live across the board when we're talking about the history of protest art. And you just spoke some of those out loud that are important. The other thing, though, about the art of protest is this is not art by artists simply hanging out in their studio, making art that helps them understand the world around them. Not that that's not important and powerful, right? How many artists do we have in the room? A whole bunch of you, right? Some of you write or make art or sing or move your bodies in a way to process chaos, to process confusion, to try to find sanity within the complex, right? But for it to be protest art, it's got to be what? It's got to be public. It has to be outside your own head. It has to be outside your sketchbook, and it has to be outside of your studio. If it doesn't have a public face to it, it then isn't really the art of protest. It may be art that is socially relevant, but it's not about mobilizing people, finding solidarity, or building awareness if it doesn't have a public component to it. So when we're going through this, you're going to see there's some commonalities between a lot of these protest artists. A lot of them are printmakers. Why printmakers? Multiples. The ultimate democratic art form, right? You come up with a great image and you can make a bunch of them, right? You also are going to see a lot of posters, poster designs, graphic design for the same reason. The medium and the message often are easy to match up, right? It also often combines image and word, which is a really powerful combination when we're talking about protest art. We're going to see art made by what I would call blue chip artists, right? So the big names, the Keith Harings, the Daumiers, all those guys. But we're also going to make sure we elevate art of protest that is made by everyday people, often whose names we don't even know. Because really, protest art is the art of the people, right? So it's important that we push it out of the museums and into the streets. So the art of protest, I also need to mention, isn't always just about the people. The state can also create what we would consider protest art or activist art. And a lot of people spend a lot of time talking about these differences between protest art and propaganda. When I say propaganda, what do you think of? Government. Isn't that funny, right? We do. When we think propaganda, we think government. We have this sense and understanding that government or the official state is behind it, right? What else do we think of when we think of propaganda? Yes? Bias. Can protest art have bias? It can, right? But there is, because we believe government is behind propaganda, that bias combined with government or the official state message makes it seem insidious to us, right? There really, in a lot of ways, isn't a lot of difference between propaganda and protest art. You could say one of the biggest differences is what perspective you're looking at it from, right? Which side of the issue do you land on? And whether you see it as propaganda or whether you see it as protest art, right? One has a more positive connotation to us than the other. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the difference between the two because we could be here for an hour doing nothing but that and it would be really boring. Well, actually, it'd be probably pretty interesting. But and I just show you this. This is some examples of posters that really relate to the art of voting. Some of these are made by artists just trying to motivate people to go vote. Some were made by the official state to motivate people to vote. Some were around certain movements, like the suffragette movement, right? So this is an example of graphic designers working around a single issue, but may have been doing it for a wide variety of reasons and reporting to different people from a responsibility standpoint. Very quickly, because you're not here to hear about me. The reason I care about this topic is I do consider myself both an artist and an activist, and I know I am not alone in that in this room. I have several faces in the audience of people that I know absolutely both are wear the artist and activist hat, and often don't wear them separately, but wear them at the same time. I've been doing activist art for, 15, 20 years now as a printmaker. This is from a series I did based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And when I was working on these in my studio, it was a way, I had found the document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was written and published right after World War II, as a means to try to get the nations of the world to all agree upon what are universal human rights, right? It is a beautiful document. It's simple. It's less than 2 pages long. It's compelling. like 95 nations adopted it, and I'm not sure anybody really follows it. But anyway, it's a great aspiration to have. It's beautiful. Eleanor Roosevelt actually sort of led the charge behind it. When I came across the document, I just fell in love with it because it seemed so simple, even though it's covering such a complicated subject. So I took each of the articles, there's 35 articles, and did an image for it. But what made this protest art was when I was done with the first 15 of them, I went around and started gluing them and wheat pasting them and tacking them up all over the city. Mostly in the urban core, downtown, Springfield, Riverside, San Marco. They were all gone within 24 hours. I'm not sure how effective at all it was. And that's something we have to ask ourselves when we look at protest art, right? It seems so powerful, and to me it seems so essential, and yet sometimes you probably do have to ask yourself, how effective is it? In some cases, highly effective. In some cases, probably less so. The fact that these were up for less than 24 hours meant they probably were not really effective. Word on the street was some of them disappeared because people really hated them. Other people took them and put them in their homes, right? Which defeated the point of them being in a public space, right? But that was my sort of first foray into art and politics. And more recently, I've been doing a series, it's a 100 Days project, where I've woke up every day for 100 days and created a work of art to help me distill the stuff going on in the world around me. And I draw it, I carve it, I print it, and I post it. And that's the public side of it, is the posting of it. So it's all kinds of topics. And this is just 6 out of the 100. And so for me, these are probably more like art as therapy than art as protest, because they're not really highly public. But there are times that I try to make my art public and actually combine the work with other artists. So last year on International Human Rights Day, I worked with 15 different artists, and we went around and we pasted messages about human rights all over the city. Some of these lasted a little longer than 24 hours, which was good. And then on a more personal level, I have established a whole organization around this idea of art and social justice, and it's called Yellow House. And it's a gallery, it's an idea, it's a hub for people who care about art and action. And so if you haven't checked it out, I hope you will. And so I wanted to share that with you because I'm coming to this tonight with the lens of more of a visual artist than a performing artist. So I'm not going to talk very much about poets, musicians, actors, playwrights, dancers, right? But we could. But I'm not going to. 1, we don't have time, and 2, I'm talking what I know, right? But I did want to recognize that actually in the world of protest and in the world of social movements, the performing arts play as big, if not at times, a bigger role than the visual arts. Civil rights movement is a great example of that, right? Where music and poetry drove people as much, if not more, than the visual arts did. But let's talk about the individual artist, right? So I love this quote by Nina Simone. An artist's duty, as far as I'm concerned, is to reflect the times. Not all artists believe this, right? And it's not the only thing that art is meant to do. Art is also meant to let us connect with beauty, right? But if you know Nina Simone's work at all, you know this is absolutely true to her truth, right? And so I wanted to bring this quote up because if we just even look at the artists involved in social movements, we have Augusta Savage, Keith Haring, Ai Weiwei, Andy Warhol, Frida Kahlo, Jacob Lawrence. Just their sheer existence as artists in those movements, where they could bring their whole selves to the table, was an extreme act of resistance. To be a gay man making art about gay culture in New York City in the 1980s itself was an act of resistance. For Jacob Lawrence to create paintings about the Black lived experience in the 19-teens and 1920s itself was an act of resistance. So yes, we're going to talk about their final products, right? These images that they put out there that compel other people. But just them being who they were doing what they were doing was radical. And I don't want that to get lost in our conversation. Then we have Diego Rivera's quote, which I also love, as we start to talk about how do artists connect with issues, right? The issues that shape society. This quote, "The role of the artist is that of the soldier of the revolution." So he really saw and lived the idea that artists were part of the revolution, could even lead the revolution. And the first kind of theme or idea we're going to touch on is how protest art intersects with war. It's probably the oldest of these artistic protest movements is to focus on war and sort of state-sanctioned violence. And really one of the earliest artists we can look at is Francisco Goya. Any of you know Goya? What do you know about Goya? Those of you who know Goya. Yes, right? So he did these sort of amazing works that were powerfully symbolic, right? Very dark at times. What else do you know about Goya? A master of aquatins. That's quite a title, right? The master of aquatins. Yeah, he was a brilliant printmaker. But he was actually a court painter. And that's what most people knew him for. He was painting for the royalty and those in power in Spain. And that's what his reputation was. But on the side, he was making these prints that were powerful, harsh, and incredibly truth-telling. And most of them never got printed during his lifetime. He did the drawings, he made the plates. Most of them got shepherded to people who could take care of them, friends that later printed them. But he knew he could not, in the position he was in, dare to print images like this from his series about the disasters of war, in which he was commenting on the corruption of power and actually making negative commentary about the people paying his paycheck, right? So you can see why he couldn't publish this stuff. But we look at them today and see them as some of the most powerful art of protest out there. But you have to say, but was it really protest art? Because nobody really saw it. There were some pieces out there, some works that were seen. But we today look at his work as universally important, right? Unfortunately. Because that means the images he was capturing feel all too familiar to us now. And that is a common theme too, and when you're talking about the art of war. So this is a lithographic poster image by an artist named Käthe Kollwitz, a German artist. She's one of my very favorite artists ever. A printmaker primarily, but also a sculptor. But her prints are extraordinary. And in the 19-teens, she was doing art that was about workers' rights, women's rights, anti-poverty, and images like this that were anti-war. She lost her job for doing this kind of work, but she never stopped. She is hardcore, and her works are incredibly powerful and really before their time. We look at her work now and it feels very 21st century, but her work was actually done in the very early part of the 20th century. This is not a great image of this, but I wanted to show it to you because I happen to believe, I say it all the time, that artists are truth tellers. Some people believe artists are soothsayers or shamans. Artists sometimes, because of the way they look at the world and move through the world, it almost seems like they can see things the rest of us can't. This is an image, right, of a protest, by an American painter named Alice Neel, right? Doesn't look anything like most of Alice Neel's paintings. But this is a painting that I think you can clearly see what's happening. You have marchers down the streets, right? And we've got this single sign, Nazis murder Jews. This was painted in 1937. What makes that strange? For those of you that know your timeline. It was before the war. Before the war. Alice and Neel is painting paintings talking about Nazis murdering Jews. Artists know. Artists and writers that are in touch with what's happening around them, just like Bob Dylan was, they often sense what's happening. They have a sense of what's going on, and they help us see the world through a different set of lenses. Problem is, we usually don't pay a lot of attention to it. We usually chalk it off as, somebody's overwrought, somebody's a little bit crazy, right? Somebody's a conspiracy theorist, whatever it is, right? We have all kind of reasons to discount those people who tend to be visionary about what's coming, especially when it's dark like this. Who painted this? Picasso. What is it a painting of?
City. An event.
It's an event, a very specific event. This painting is called Guernica, and it is a painting that also relates to World War II, specifically the bombing of a village by Franco's forces, he was a friend of the Nazis. And Picasso, who you could also say was not a political artist. Picasso painted Picasso. He painted his world, his life, his lovers, right? He was definitely a man of his time, especially in the way he dealt with aesthetics and style. But this is definitely his most political work and one of the most important political works ever painted. And it's huge, it's massive. I mean, it's larger than this wall. So it looks kind of funny, this size. But a powerful painting that speaks to the horrors of war, and shocked the world when they saw this painting. Even though it's not realistic, it contains the energy of fear, anxiety, angst, loss. It's loud. The black and white quality of it, sort of taps into that same graphic quality that our printmakers we've been looking at do. And so this is a powerful image of protest art. But really, for the majority of its lifetime, it wasn't even seen in Spain. It was shown in New York City at MoMA. But it helped move people to care about what was happening in Spain. And that is one of the important aspects of the art of protest. If art is meant to be a part of a social movement, it has to move people. It either has to awaken you, right, by building awareness or sharing knowledge, or it has to move you in some way to want to engage in an issue or to react to an issue. This is a super tough image, but it's war, right? If art wasn't ugly when it was dealing with war, then it wouldn't be truthful. So this is a work that was created by a group called the Art Workers Coalition. So this was a group of artists during the 1960s who focused on many causes, but primarily they were standing up against the Vietnam War. And so they had photographers in the field that were primarily working as journalists. But then those journalistic photographers would partner with artists in this coalition. And so here we have this infamous photograph that actually moved a lot of people for obvious reasons. But when combined with an artist who was a designer who added these words onto it, and for those of you who can't see it, it says Q, like question, and babies, question mark, A, answer, and babies, period. And the photograph is, of course, of a massacre of children. these images, sometimes when we see them, they're shocking, they seem indulgent at times, but they were being done for a very specific reason. They were being done to try to amplify an issue, to put out into the world images that would shock, would provoke, would inspire people to care or engage. And unfortunately, art that deals with war is everywhere. It's across cultures, it's across nations, it's across eras. You could take so many of these images. Some of these are from Vietnam War, some our invasion into Iraq, some World War II, some of the war in Syria. You could take off any of the specific details and you could apply any one of these images to all of those. So unfortunately, art of protest that deals with war usually ends up being quite universal. And some of those images stick and often get used time over time and become almost this bridge between the past and the present, and sometimes even that sort of glimpse like Alice Neel gave us into the future. Graphic designers in the house? We have graphic designers? Oh, of course we do, because we have Mr. Mervin here, yeah. Yeah, I mean, here I think on this slide you can especially see why graphic designers and printmakers play such a huge role in art of protest. That delivery of images that are powerful and sharp and clean and easy to read. But we also don't want to forget art in the hands of the masses. This is of the largest anti-Vietnam War march that happened in Washington, D.C. in 1968. And yes, everybody's holding up posters, and some of them handmade and some of them printed. But this need for people to not just raise their voice, not just show up with their feet marching in the street, but to be able to visually display to the world what they're thinking, what they want, what they desire, what they demand. And somebody mentioned Banksy earlier, right? So we go from things like that protest image, which is literally millions of people, to these sort of singular images, right? So Banksy is, you know, the person that nobody knows who he is. I like to think that it's a she. But goes around, and people go around probably for him or her, wheat pasting these images literally all over the world at this point. And this is one of many that he has done that comment specifically on war, or the relationship between soldiers and communities, or the replacement of violence with love. So his images are far-ranging, but this is just one of them. And because they end up in a public place, that's why we can consider them art of protest. They are meant to move the people on the street who see it. But I also like images like this that are not by Banksy, but by a little or unknown artist in Syria, who's not making images on the edges of conflict, but in the center of conflict. Taking a building that is literally collapsed because of it being bombed and putting an image on it, which in some ways is shocking. You know, this little girl sort of stands on a pile of skulls and yet paints hope up in the air. Super powerful. The function of art is to do more than tell it like it is. It's to imagine what is possible. Bell hooks. And I think that really describes art of the feminist movement. So I'm not going to talk about every social movement, but I'm talking about a couple of them sort of in depth, because imagery played a huge role in some of these movements. And the feminist movement is definitely one of those. This photograph of Gloria Steinem and Dorothy Pittman Hughes is one that is timeless in describing what we wanted the feminist movement to be, right? So again, we have those raised fists that we talked about earlier, but this is also an image about intersectionality, right? This is an image of a black woman and a white woman standing together, fighting for change. But they weren't the ones to invent powerful women in art, to speak to women in leadership and women as holding the divine spark sometimes, or sometimes the real power, not necessarily power given by state, but the kind of power that can move people. This has to be my favorite Käthe Kollwitz image of this incredible woman who's like a mountain, standing with her arms raised in front of this group of warring peasants. This is an image from a peasants' war, and really speaks to sort of the working class, and her being where we're seeing her back. She becomes this universal symbol, right? And so even though Käthe Kollwitz protested many things, she's always been held up also as a feminist icon within that movement. And then this is a work by Judy Chicago. And some people debate whether this is actually protest art or not, but I would say it is, because it's really the first epic work of feminist art that was made. Judy Chicago was an artist, a teacher. She was disgusted with teaching art in Fresno on her campus because they never talked about women artists. So she started teaching a class for women artists about women artists off campus, because you couldn't teach one on campus. This would have been in 1970. And so that was the start of actually a movement of women being trained by women to make art about women. And this particular piece, entitled The Dinner Party, is this very famous work. It's at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And it's place settings, and each place setting represents a famous woman from history. Some of them are real women. Some of them are mythical women that we all know their names of. But it's all about, if women weren't going to be invited to the table, they would just create their own. And that's exactly what Judy Chicago did with this piece. We have people like Barbara Kruger, who also deals with themes of power dynamics, of gender dynamics. A lot of her work deals with racial equity. I did not bring her most recent works, which I will tell you are fantastic. They're brutal. They're hilarious at times. But they're very specifically against a sitting president. So I left them out of tonight's lecture, but you should go check them out because they're pretty amazing, actually. But hers become public because things like this were created to be a billboard. They weren't created to be in a museum, though they ended up in museums. They were created to be out in the public, on the sides of buses and on billboards. Y'all know these people? The Guerrilla Girls? Probably the ultimate in artists trying to push a movement, right? So the Guerrilla Girls are a group of feminist artists who do everything anonymously. So they always wear gorilla masks when they're out doing their thing. And people always say, oh, there's only 4 or 5 of them. There's actually been like 60 women who have come through it, right? But they take on names of famous women artists from the past, right? So nobody knows who these women are. But they basically are guerrilla artists, meaning, which of course is the play on wearing the gorilla. But they're going around, still are doing their thing, 25 years in, trying to hold organizations and communities accountable for the roles that women play versus the roles that women should play and could play. One of their favorite targets is art museums. It's one of the reasons I like them. Because they understand what a serious issue it is when you have museums where their collections, only like 2% of their collections represent women artists, right? Which we know that's not what the history of art looks like. But museums have perpetuated that, right, by showing very few women artists. Now that's changing slightly. I think the percentage is now up to like 8% of museum collections are women artists. But they did stuff like this, which I just love this piece. This was a billboard, right, and did end up in museums, which I find just wonderful and ironic. Do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum, right? 4% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 76% of the nudes are female. Those are powerful statements to be making, right? And in a world that, you know, until people like the Guerrilla Girls started like poking holes in them, were the ones that were defining what culture is, right? And they started questioning that, not just through a feminist lens, but eventually also through a racial equity lens. And then this is an artist I wanted to make sure you knew. She is a young artist working today. Her name is Tatiana Fazoli. She works in New York, works in Austin, works all over the place. But she developed this really powerful series of works that happens on the street entitled Stop Telling Women to Smile. And it was her way of explaining to the guys on the street, when you are telling us you like our dress, or you're telling me to smile, or you're whistling at me, I don't appreciate it, and neither do most women. And it's one of those things that we know is like really frustrating, but like, how do you deal with it? Well, instead of putting her art in a museum, which would do no good in delivering that message, right? We paste it right on the street. So this one is actually a portrait of her. But what I love about Tatiana's work is that she goes into communities and sits down with women and says, tell me your story. What's your story on the street? And then she draws their portrait, captures their words, prints it up, puts it on the wall in that community. So she doesn't have to be the one standing on the street giving it back to that guy who just isn't getting it, right? Her image can be doing that. And we know change can sometimes happen through art in a way that it's hard to make it happen nose to nose with other people, because that's awkward, right? Art can almost be like this intermediary for creating change. And so I love her work because it feels really personal in a way, and yet she lifts it up into this sort of realm of change making. My outfit is not an invitation. I so want to bring her to Jacksonville. I think she'd be great here. And then the last thing around this feminist movement I wanted to share with you was kind of almost an ultimate gathering of art of protest, which was around the Women's March in the months after the last presidential election. And these are 3 posters created by the artist Shepard Fairey, who is he's a remarkable designer, having huge success. But he created these 3 images, which I love because they spoke to the hopes of the Women's March. Not that it necessarily reached it, but this was the hope of the Women's March, that it would be this ultimate statement for women to make that was also very intersectional, that really included all women. And so these were printed up by the thousands and given out for free in DC. So as women were coming from all over the country and getting off their buses, you could go and get a Shepard Fairey print and carry it through the march, right? So you would literally walk down the street and see thousands of these images combined with other people's statements and images. And it was just very, very powerful, really moving. But of course, the Women's March, one of the things I love about it is this idea of the art of the people showing up on the streets. That anybody could put their message and their image on a poster board, on their bodies, on their clothing, on their hats, on their faces, and make known what they felt and how they felt. And so you see just a sampling of some of the posters. That's me.
Oh.
Yeah, my poster was way too big. I took these big posters because I was like, I'm going to be seen. But it was like 12 hours on your feet, nowhere to sit, nowhere to eat, nowhere to pee, and I've got like these 5-foot posters. But anyway, it was good. It was good. I wouldn't trade it. Art is the only sensible, primal response to an outlook of possible destruction or obliteration. If you feel like you and your people are about to be destroyed, Keith Haring is saying art is probably the only reasonable way to respond. The only thing that might have power. That's a powerful statement for somebody to make, right? And of course, he's making it in regards to the social movement that popped up around LGBTQ rights, which, yes, started all the way back with Stonewall 50 years ago, but really came to a head during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, centered around New York, but not only in New York. And Keith Haring's work was incredibly public, right? It was happening in subways, it was happening on street corners, it was happening on walls of hotels and walls of alleyways, and played a very important role in making it okay to have the conversation around the crisis of AIDS, protecting our neighbors, caring for our neighbors, loving one another, supporting one another, and healing from what was incredible loss. And of course, the art of protest didn't stop with Keith Haring. The AIDS quilt, the official name of it is the Names Project, is probably the largest public art project ever. Over 480,000 quilt squares made by individual people. Started with just a couple of people coming together in a storefront in San Francisco because they were bound and determined for the names of the loved ones they had lost to not be forgotten, because they knew they would be forgotten, because the stigma was so huge. And so one small quilt became a bigger quilt, became more quilts, and it was being done literally all over the world. And this is the large installation that happened on the Mall in Washington, D.C. But you can see and access parts of the Names Quilt all over the country. We even show it annually here in Jacksonville in December. There's always several panels in City Hall, ironically. But a really powerful display of everyday people making art to lift up an issue so that people would pay attention to it. Has anybody ever seen parts of the Names Quilt? What was your experience with it?
Walking around the room, everybody was just so quiet. That's what I just remember.
There is a reverence, right? There's a reverence to this particular project. You can be in a space with hundreds of people viewing it, and you're right, like nobody speaks. It's a lot like going to a memorial, because that is what it is intended to be, a portable memorial. But a memorial of loss and a celebration of those individuals.
I now have a quote for myself.
My 5th grade art teacher was memorialized by our high school for this.
Wow, so real personal connections to this, right? So the art of protest isn't always about being loud and standing on the tip of a sword. Sometimes the art of protest is something very personal and quiet. But its power comes when my personal and quiet stitches with your personal and quiet, which stitches with yours, stitches with yours, stitches with yours. So it becomes bigger than all of us as individuals, right? And I had to show you this. I don't know if y'all know this guy. Chip Southworth, for a while known as Keith Haring's ghost. So when Jacksonville was debating, should our gay, lesbian, trans, queer neighbors have the same rights I do? The first go around, so this would have been 2013. Chip went undercover and channeled Keith Haring into Jacksonville And he went around and started painting images on electrical boxes that were about universal love, right? They were terrific. And, you know, some people were like, he's like knocking off Keith Haring, but that's okay. I mean, he was being very honest about what he was doing, very transparent, but he wasn't being honest about who he was. Very few of us knew who he was. It's just every morning you'd wake up and there'd be another electrical box with images of gay lovers, right? And people were flipping out. People were upset. People were like whitewashing these things. The cops were like, how do we find this person? They finally did. And he was arrested and thrown in jail for vandalizing property. But he ended up, as a result, changing policy around art in public places within our city. And I think along the way, it opened up a channel for conversations in our city that needed to happen. Because you could sort of talk about this and not really talk about like why it was upsetting you so much. Was it really that he was painting electrical boxes? Or was it because of what he was painting, right? And those were the conversations that started happening, which was super powerful. The second go around in trying to pass a Human Rights Ordinance, which thank goodness was finally successful, we had another local artist who I wanted to bring in to this conversation, Karen Kurycki and Summer Wood, two artists who worked together to do portraits for 100 days every day. They did a portrait of somebody who was engaged in the fight for human rights for LGBTQ. And they would do the portrait and post it online. And so what it was doing is it was lifting up everyday activists. Some of them in the LGBTQ community, others who were allies and co-conspirators. And it was a powerful project and one that actually made a difference in bringing some attention to the issues so that it actually finally could be passed by our city council. And then the last group of artists I want to mention around this particular issue, the social movement around LGBTQ, is a group called ACT UP. They formed actually in the 1960s, but got really busy in the 1980s in not just being satisfied making visual works of art, but actually taking some pretty radical actions, right? In Wall Street, closing down highways, closing down federal government offices, demanding things like access to medicine, demanding policy changes for people who were fighting with AIDS. And so it was a really radical movement, but led by artists, led by writers, graphic designers, poets, actors, really, really powerful, and still has an impact today. And of course, the mother of all movements, social movements in this country where the arts played a big role, is of course the civil rights movement. And its connection to today with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I share this Martin Luther King Jr. quote with you. As my sufferings mounted, I soon realized that there were two ways in which I could respond to my situation, either to react with bitterness or seek to transform the suffering into a creative force. I decided to follow the latter course. And Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were quoted multiple times about the power of art within the movement. The ability for song to rally people. The ability for photographers in particular. Oh, there is a Norman Rockwell. He did get in there with Ruby Bridges. But when Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were talking about artists in the movement, they often highlighted the importance of photographers. Many of those photographers were embedded within the movement and were there to capture the images that then got blasted out to the world. So yes, some of that happened on the news, some of it happened through film, but a lot of it happened through still photography, done in the hands of very, very skilled artists who also had a passion for the cause. And these images literally moved mountains. Artists like Jacob Lawrence. We've already talked a little bit about Jacob Lawrence. I mentioned him. But as an artist, as part of the Harlem Renaissance, creating images that were specifically about the Black experience. And not just trying to share those images with Black audiences, but trying to make sure all audiences saw these images. Images of hope and aspiration, but also images of trauma, of crisis, right? Of brutality, of inequity. And these are from his Great Migration series, which is his real masterwork. And Elizabeth Catlett, who gets us back to that sort of printmaking as protest. She was both a printmaker and a sculptor, but did very, very powerful images that set solidly in the center of the civil rights movement. And Charles White, whose work I love, because his work in a way, Charles White's work lacks the some of the anger, the vitriol, and a lot of people mistaken it for art that is soft. There was nothing soft about what Charles White was doing. And I want to read a quote to you by him as you look at this image. I am interested in the social, even the propaganda angle in painting. But I feel that the job of everyone in a creative field is to picture the whole scene. I'm interested in creating a style that is much more powerful, that will take in both the technical end and at the same time will say what I have to say. Paint is the only weapon I have with which to fight what I resent. If I could write, I would write about it. If I could talk, I would talk about it. But since I paint, I must paint about it, right? So the paintbrush as a weapon, and he did it beautifully. If you've ever seen a show of his work, you're changed forever. And then as part of the movement, civil rights movement, we have Afro-Cobra. This particular image is by Barbara Jones. This was a movement mostly of printmakers. But what I love about what Afro-Cobra was doing is they were doing art that was positive, but highly political and pro-Black, period. And so it was art that, because they were printmakers and because it had a strong graphic quality, was reproduced heavily towards the end years of the civil rights movement. So today, when we think about the civil rights movement and the role that art plays, one role that art plays today is in pulling the history of the civil rights movement forward to us. And why do we need to do that? Why would artists in the 21st century care about painting murals of Malcolm X?
Because it's relevant for today.
It's relevant for today, absolutely.
It's important to remember what happened in the civil rights movement and carry it forward to the future so that people would never forget what happened.
Excellent.
I think there's a tendency, when you think about the civil rights movement, to think of it in the past. And it's
The past ain't past, is it?
And
We ain't
I
there
think
yet.
I think it's a reminder that the civil rights movement is still continuing.
That's right. That's right. And we have to remember, for so many people, knowing anything about the history of the civil rights movement didn't happen. So part of this making it visual, right? Part of this desire in the late 20th and early 21st century to bring these images back up is a correction to a wrongly told history. It's making visible what was hidden from us, right? We have our own example of this. So this is a mural in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, of course, has an amazing mural project. But this is our own mural in Jacksonville, which I would argue is the most important social justice work of art that we have in our city. It's called the Hope and History Mural Project. And it's a mural that depicts images and scenes from Axe Handle Saturday, which was a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement here in Jacksonville. Does anybody here heard of Axe Handle Saturday?
Yeah.
If you've heard of it, what can you tell me about it? I'm not going to put you on the spot to do an essay, but just what do you know about it?
I know that people today deny and lie about it like it never happened, and that was a very big part of the interview that we did with them last semester.
Yeah, people then pretended like it didn't happen, right? Including the media, who blacked out locally that this thing happened in the heart of our city. What else do you know about Axe Handle Saturday? What was it?
There were teenagers, like, they were eating at a lunch counter, and then all these people, like KKK members and stuff, came out with, like, axe handles, and they beat them, and then they even beat, like, I've seen that picture of the boy, like, he wasn't even protesting, he was just downtown, and, like, they just started beating people, and they, like, chased them into Hemming Park and beat them. Really horrific.
Right. So Jim Crow South, right? Segregation, young black men and women trying to desegregate spaces downtown, the lunch counters in particular, and exactly like you described, right? Well, we happen to have somebody with us tonight who was part of that day, Mr. Rodney Hurst, who is a good friend and a badass. Am I allowed to say that? He is a badass. And I'm going to ask Rodney. I already asked him if I could put him on the spot. I wasn't sure if he was going to be here, but he is. So, like, why would I tell the story? Because one of the important things when you are trying to be an ally or a co-conspirator is do not talk over people whose voices we really should be listening to. So, Mr. Hurst, would you be willing to give us a couple minutes to describe this project and why this was important to you to, in 2018, put a mural on the side of a building?
Good evening. First of all, Hope McMath is one of the seminal persons in the art movement here in this community. And of course, the comments you've just made, you've just heard, were unsolicited comments. And for the legal staff of FSCJ, I'm going to say whatever I say, then I'm going to leave. Protests are supposed to make you uncomfortable. The art of protests is supposed to make you uncomfortable. Talking racism is supposed to make you uncomfortable. Understanding the history of racism in Jacksonville, in this country, and in this country should make you uncomfortable. Because white folk in this community, in this state, and in this country only understand their privilege, which they accrue as a result of core racist attitudes in a racist country built on racism, both Christian, social, and political racism. I got involved in black history and the civil rights movement at age 11 through my 8th grade American history teacher, whose name was Rutledge Pearson, who would not let us use an American history textbook approved for Negro students that only had the names of George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington. And we studied American history independent and exclusive of that book written by racist textbook authors and racist historians. Mr. Pearson also said in his classroom, freedom is not free. If you're not a part of the solution, you are a part of the problem. And he encouraged us to join the Youth Council NAACP, which I did at age 11. At age 15, I was president of the Youth Council. At age 16, started school when I was 5 and I got skipped. So I graduated from high school at age 16. I was president of the Youth Council and led the sit-in demonstrations downtown. In fact, this is the cover of my book, and this handsome young fellow right here is me at age 16. This handsome young fellow over here is also me with Roy Wilkins. Now, as we talked about, as I wrote the book, it was never about a hot dog and a Coke, which I wrote because I was angry because people lie about what happened during that time. And the fact that the press did not document what happened at that time, they purposefully blacked out all news about the sit-in demonstrations. The Florida Publishing Company at the Times Union, Channel 4 and Channel 12, and Channel 4 at the time was a post-Newsweek station. And they blacked out all news about this seminal event, this violent event in the history of Jacksonville, where high school students set in at heretofore white lunch counters in downtown Jacksonville were attacked by 200 whites with axe handles and baseball bats. The police knew that the attack was going to come, and the police was nowhere around during the sit-in demonstrations and that day until we were attacked downtown. So as I wrote the book, my purpose was to tell the story. Fast forward to 2018 when the Center for Urban Education and Policy and Chris Jansen as the director and Rudy Jameson as the assistant director and Hope McMath as an important part of that group, that pattern, that puzzle, decided that we needed to do a mural about civil rights. And they got 25 high school students, black and white. Many of them were no older than I was when I was president and when I led the sit-ins. And for a year, the Center for Urban Education and Policy bought copies of the book, and for a year, we taught those 25 young black and white students about Jacksonville's chapter in the civil rights movement. I took them to Hemming Park and I told them and I walked them through different parts where whites in Confederate uniform gave out free axe handles, where the police would not come, where Charlie Griffin there in the middle, who was not a part of the youth council, he was just downtown shopping, was beaten by 4 whites with axe handles. And they understood what it was about. And they decided, we need to put this up. They decided what went up, and even though they were not muralists, they were led by a young lady named Nicole Holderbaum, who was the lead muralist for that project. But they understood it, even though many of them had never heard, like you, had never heard about Axe Handle Saturday. Now understand why when you say the art of protest and when you talk about different things in this community, you are now at a point where you are independent thinkers. You're getting ready to be the future brain trust of this country, and you know nothing about what happened in your hometown. Hope is an important part of art history. I never got involved in art when I was coming along because white folk did not want me in their facilities. Come-Up Museum didn't want me there, and I didn't want to go there. It wasn't until Hope invited me one day, and she can tell you later about that invitation, that I went to Come-Up. Even though I'm a native of Jacksonville, I didn't want to go to Come-Up. And now I am seeing for the first time, after understanding what black artists were doing all along, James Weldon Johnson writing Lift Every Voice and Saying had nothing to do with presidents. Nothing about presidents and Lift Every Voice and Saying, which he wrote in 1900 here in Jacksonville. He wrote that about the condition of black folk who were being lynched on an average of 3 to 5 a week. We don't know that. It is not taught in schools. Many of you didn't even know that James Weldon Johnson wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing in Jacksonville, both black and white. So we got a lot of work to do. And those of you who profess to be artists, who want to be on the cutting edge of different things, if you think that being on the cutting edge will make you comfortable, then stay home. Get out of this. Get on the sidelines. Talk on the sidelines. Get out of the way of other folk who want to do something. Continue to live your nice white and black life, doing whatever you need to do and not getting in the way of folk who want to see some change happen. Hope is a friend. And the reason I'm here tonight, because I usually don't come to these gatherings because they're superficial. White folk and black folk get together and we sing kumbaya and hold hands, and all of a sudden now that's my contribution to how the world is going to change, and you continue to do the same things you do over and over and over again. You don't teach black history at FSCJ, you don't teach it at Edward Waters, you don't teach it at JU, you don't teach it at the University of North Florida. We still lie about American history, which is both incomplete, dishonest, and racist. And we don't try to do anything about it because it makes us too uncomfortable if we want to do something about it. So understand, when you say the art of protest, that's action. It's not the theory of what should be. It's the actuality of what you can do.
I don't know, some Black history got taught here tonight. Thank you, Rodney, very much. And that mural is incredibly powerful. It's on A. Philip Randolph Boulevard on the side of the East Side Brotherhood building, and it's amazing. And the front of the building is equally as amazing. So I hope you will check it out. Thank you, Rodney, for speaking your truth tonight. So we've got this thing with like public murals and all that, but I wanted to show this image because I think it also helps speak to this marriage of what was happening and what should happen in effective social movements, right? So on the bottom corner, we have a book called Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And from that came the creation of these protest posters called I Am a Man, which were being used by the sanitation workers in Memphis in the 1960s as they were fighting for workers' rights. It was an economic struggle at that point, a workers' struggle. And this was a struggle that Martin Luther King was playing a powerful role in leading. In fact, it was really when Martin Luther King started to talk about economics that got him killed. It was talking about economic equity that got him murdered. So this is the protest that was going on in Memphis when Martin Luther King was killed. So we have this book that inspired this graphic image that was used, and then here you have a painting that was created by the artist Glenn Ligon in 1980, pulling those words in that image sort of out of the historic protest movement photographs and making it a painting on a wall. This is important because these threads of connection over time between the arts is a really important piece of keeping movements going. In fact, there's a contemporary artist whose name, or he goes by the name Dred Scott, which of course is a name associated with the period right leading up to the Civil War, in which the Supreme Court basically deemed that black people, free or otherwise, could not be considered citizens. So Dred Scott is a contemporary performance artist, visual artist, activist, and he is here pictured wearing an altered sign that says, I am not a man. And this is a means of protest against police brutality, contemporary police brutality against young black men. Here, for those of you that can read what's going on in that image, what's going on? Can you see what's happening?
Firefighter spraying water.
Firefighter spraying water into the face of Dred Scott. What does that reference?
Those black girls get rolled down the street.
Yeah, references all those images from the civil rights movement of people being knocked down with water hoses in cities, not just throughout the South, but throughout the country, but especially in the South. Anybody know about this and what this references historically? So this one says, this flag hanging outside of a building says, a man was lynched by police yesterday. There's a historic flag that simply said, not simply, but said, a man was lynched today. And it used to get hung outside the window of the NAACP offices on Fifth Avenue in New York City every day that a man was lynched. So basically, that flag was outside that window almost every single day. Dred Scott took that historic flag, that historic image, and made it contemporary, helping us understand that there is an absolute connection between the era of slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, and the moment in which we live today. Sonia Clark. She's become one of my very favorite political artists. Sonia Clark, based in South Carolina, and that matters. Place matters to many of these artists. She takes Confederate flags, puts them on the wall in various iterations. Sometimes there's multiples, sometimes they're small, sometimes they're big. And they become unraveled. She starts the unraveling, but the power of her work is that when you walk into a space where one of Sonia's pieces is hanging, you are asked to help tear it down. You are asked, I just chilly bumps from my neck to my toes just now. You go and you literally are invited to pull away the threads. And when asked by a critic, what is your business destroying that flag for? She said, for me, this is less about destruction, and it is about the slow, tedious, methodical process we all have to engage in tearing down the history of white supremacy, one string at a time. And she's very clear to say, and as a black woman, it's not just my job to do that. You all have to join in that. Right? It's highly personal for her, big issue, very public, universal. Everybody's invited to the table. Powerful stuff, right? So a lot of people would say the art of protest, especially when you're dealing with Black lives, sort of began and ended with the civil rights movement. But I would say that Sonia Clark is a brilliant sort of current contemporary voice for that work. And so is Damon Davis. This is Ferguson, Missouri. In the weeks, months, year, actually, after Michael Brown's death at the hands of a police officer. And during the time of looting that happened, which was to be expected because rage does overflow, store owners were boarding up their stores, sometimes because there had already been damage, and sometimes to try to avoid damage. And they did the same thing again when the verdict came out. We know how that verdict goes, because they all go that way. But what Damon did was take those boarded up buildings, and with the permission of the shop owners, took these photographs he had taken of the hands of the protesters and started lining the streets of Ferguson with these, sort of recapturing these images of destruction and death into something that the citizens that were still living there could own. He took a gesture of surrender, hands up, don't shoot, and turned it into a symbol of resistance. Super simple, right? People's hands, your hands, your hands, your hands. They're old, young, black, white, brown. And it became, he took these images of hopelessness that the media was especially putting out there as Ferguson was burning, and he turned it upside down by putting these images on the wall. And really, the Black Lives Matter movement art is so embedded within that work. It's a huge piece of lifting up personal stories of tragedy, important narratives of triumph. It's professional artists putting their images around policies and the change they want to see, but it's also people just going out into the street, not just with their feet, but with words and images as well. So I'm going to wrap up by sharing just a couple examples of work that hits on issues that are really contemporary to us, right? Ai Weiwei, if my art has nothing to do with people's pain and sorrow, what is art for? It sort of echoes what Rodney was talking about. Does that mean every work of art that every artist makes does that? No. But an awareness of that consistently and constantly means that our art must also tell this story. And Ai Weiwei himself, Chinese dissident artist, he lives this, he breathes this. So this is a huge sculptural installation of rebar. You guys all know what rebar is, right? It's that kind of rusty metal dowels almost that hold up structures, right? It gets embedded in concrete. Well, when there was the big earthquake in the Sichuan province in 2008 in China, some of you may remember the story, some of you were probably too little maybe to remember it, but schools collapsed. And it was found, or it was believed at the time, that they collapsed because of very shoddy construction. So the government, of course, wasn't going to investigate, and they weren't being transparent. So Ai Weiwei, as an artist, he's an artist now. He's not a social worker, he's not an architect, he's an artist. Gets together a team of people to do a citizen's inspection. And they go out to these sites, and they document, and they talk to people, and they document, and they listen. And they document, and they listen. And they document, and they listen. And what they documented was over 5,000 children died. And the official number had only been like 200. And it was because of shoddy government construction and inspection. These are the pieces of rebar that he collected from those sites. And he and his team straightened them and then laid them out in these huge galleries and warehouses, and the walls are covered with the names of the 5,000 children. I saw this when it was in New York. It was incredibly moving. It was incredibly powerful because you just got the sense that each one of these sort of held that energy. And so it was a very, very powerful statement. And because it's so big, you experience it with other people, sort of like the quilts, super quiet in there. This is what he calls the laundry. So these are all clothes gathered from people on the island of Lesbos in Greece who had fled by boat from Syria during the Syrian war. And as they would get there and their clothes would get discarded, some of them didn't survive. Ai Weiwei spent months over on Lesbos, and he collected these up and presents them here as this sort of laundromat or this Goodwill store. And all of the images on the wall and on the floor are social media images of families looking for the people that they lost. And that's a museum piece, which matters, but this piece matters more. So this is also by Ai Weiwei. And this is of a performing arts hall in Berlin, right in the center of the city of Berlin. Can anybody tell what's wrapped around the columns?
Life jackets?
Life jackets. These are the life jackets discarded by those who fled Syria and found themselves as refugees on the island of Lesbos in Greece. 14,000 life jackets that he and his people put up literally in one night, overnight. Because if you try to do this stuff during the day, you're going to get stopped. So people all of a sudden wake up in Berlin and like their performing arts hall, which was getting ready to have this week-long festival of the performing arts. And Ai Weiwei is saying, you can get all into your classical culture, but I'm not going to let you forget what's happening right now in our world. And that we all have to own this as an issue. This matters more than those museum pieces to me, because this is in the public, it can't be avoided. Those museum pieces are for people who go to museums. This is for everybody walking down the street in Berlin. And occasionally, art itself becomes the controversy and the problem. And so artists have to actually take on the arts. A little navel-gazing here, but it matters. And at this moment, there's a lot of this happening. So this is a show at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Arts by Chuck Close. So Chuck Close is known for doing these very, very large paintings, photorealistic painting portraits of friends and family. He was called out in the last year as part of the Me Too movement by multiple women as being somebody who sexually harassed and raped them. Pennsylvania Academy already had this show up. And they got into this big debate. What do we do? Do we take the show down? Like it's only going to be up for like another month. What do we do? What do we do? They decided to actually make it a moment for the community to be engaged in that conversation. So here's what the Pennsylvania Academy of Art did, because the artists pushed them to. So this is the Chuck Close show, which would have been right through that door. The outside of it, they took down the works that were on view and did a show entitled, Who Do We Need to Hear From? And it's an exhibition of art of women by women. So before you can even walk in the Chuck Close show in its closing weeks, you first were confronted by women and gender nonconforming artists doing work about the female experience. And then on the final day of the show, they closed his show 3 hours early, locked the doors, and the public came in and did a printmaking project, a collective printmaking project, where the public came in all day long making images. They shut the doors of the Chuck Close show, and they covered the doors with the stories of the people. I share it with you because it's an interesting example of, again, art can become part of the problem, but that you can have both professional artists and the masses respond in a really powerful and forceful way. This is actually happening in museums all over the world right now. So this is the scene at the Guggenheim in New York City. This is outside the Guggenheim. This is inside the Whitney. This is also in the Whitney after a controversy of a painting done by a white woman in a show curated by a white woman that was speaking to the experience of Emmett Till, the story of Emmett Till. So here you actually have members of the public standing in front of that painting with a shirt that says Black Death Spectacle. So they turned that into a space of protest. But these people are protesting arts institutions and their practices, not paying people enough while they're taking in big donations. This is a protest, this is a die-in. So the Guggenheim was one of the museums taking money from the Sackler family. That they're the family that has basically funded the opioid crisis in this nation. And the Sacklers are one of the biggest donors to arts organizations in this country and abroad. So museums right now are being faced with, oh my goodness, we took millions of dollars. This is blood money. What do we do? We've got their name up in lights on our museum. What do we do? These people are telling them, you better do something, because we're going to show up in your lobby. And these people all did a big old die-in, and they were all, holding like empty pill bottles. I mean, it's a powerful moment, right? And then this here is at the Whitney. Warren Kanders is on their board, and he is the vice president of an organization called Safariland. Safariland is an organization that makes all of the tear gas and light weaponry that's being used along the border right now. Remember those images of mothers and children running away from tear gas? All those tear gas cans had the Safariland logo on them. So at the Whitney, they're saying, this dude needs to be off our board. He can go about doing his thing, but he should not be part of a major cultural institution. Safariland is based in Jacksonville. Did y'all know that? There's a list of about 30 nonprofits in this city that take money from Safariland. That's a different lecture. We can't leave out our political cartoonists as people who don't just focus on one issue, but focus on all the issues, right? These are by Ed Hall, one of our great local artists, right? That powerfully, every single day, is making images that help us try to distill the weirdness of the world around us. And then there are works of art that appear that we don't even know who made them because they're part of a collective. This is from a collective called Four Freedoms. And they're doing public art all over the country, mostly on billboards. And this, it's hard to see in here, but it says Make America Great Again. But in the background, it's got a historic image on the bridge at Selma of the police facing off with the protesters, the people trying to walk across the bridge. But it's not all about those blue chip artists. It's not all about the Whitney and the Met and all those places. It's also about people just saying, I care about this. This matters to me. How do I use whatever skills I have or whatever group of people I'm hanging out with to make a statement, to get my voice out there? This is from the Dakota Pipeline protests. We have no idea who made this incredible image. This is an image that is about the environment. It's about right to clean water. It's about our First Nations and the fact that we are all standing on ground that really does not belong to us. In one painting, just propped up there on the side of a dirt road. We don't even know who made this. But the person was obviously compelled to make it, not only because they probably needed to make it, but to also help rally and build solidarity amongst the people who were there. And sometimes we need art to help heal us as we're going through these things. I love this George Brock quote. Art is a wound turned into light. And so after the terrorist killings in Paris 2 years back, moments like this happen where musicians are pulling pianos out into the middle of the street and they just start playing John Lennon's Imagine. Because they wanted to recapture their streets. And it was public. They could have just gone into their own house and done this, right? And like cried onto the keys. That's what I would have done, except I don't play the piano. But he did it public so that others could be a part of it. And the group kept growing. And the aerial photographs of this scene is unbelievable. There are so many people wrapped around this piano by the end of the afternoon. They could have never heard the piano, but they didn't need to. Because the person in front of them was singing, and the person in front of them was singing, and the person in front of them was singing. Or after the shootings at the Pulse nightclub. Artists were a huge part of helping that community heal, of not denying the truth of what happened when a man walked into a nightclub filled with people and gunned them down, because they were gay and Latinx. The community, driven by artists, said, oh no, this is not how we're going to be defined. And even just recently in New Zealand. I show you this because so much of what happens with protest art is spontaneous. Within an hour, they had taken this, this sort of symbol of New Zealand, right, of Christchurch, which is this silver fern leaf, and an artist took it and altered it to where people are looking at their shadow, and it's clearly of somebody, often of another gender or another faith. Sometimes that's all that is needed, is some sort of symbol to help people remember what we want to be and what we have the capacity to be. And just yesterday, Yo-Yo Ma, one of our most brilliant living musicians, showed up to the border and played Bach to show that there is more that connects us than divides us. And in his verbal comments, he said, we are not a hotel. We are not full. Beautiful quote. And he said, and I know that music has the power to remind us of our common humanity. And sometimes we just need those symbols that take the need for words and the complication of language and misunderstanding out of the equation. And you can see one image. This is a sculpture that now sits outside the United Nations. It was actually created because of one incident. It was created by an artist after John Lennon's murder in 1980. So it was made as an anti-violence image as a response to that. And it has now become this iconic image that unfortunately is all too relevant, right? So I can promise you, whatever the issues are in our community that need attention, the artists will be there. And in Paul Robeson's words, artists are the gatekeepers of truth. We are civilization's radical voice. Thank you.